So ultimately, we need to make safety our core value. And just to highlight the stuff that Ellen talked about, our serious safety event, skill-based, rule-based, or knowledge-based, which one of those three, skill-based, rule-based, or knowledge-based, is the most common cause of serious safety events?
Knowledge.
What's that? Knowledge? What'd you guys say?
That's what I was going to say too, because there's so many more.
So, so knowledge has the highest rate of error, but we actually generally recognize and try to stay out of knowledge-based. What's when we're in knowledge-based error? What's the remedy for knowledge-based error? Consult. So we're pretty good. So actually, rule-based accounts for 70% of serious safety events. Healthcare is a very rule-based organization. Rules in healthcare. This is what you do. This is what you don't do. And so 70% of serious safety events are rule-based. 15% are skill-based, and 15% are knowledge-based. So making safety our core value is our approach and what we need to do here at this organization. And in this diagram, safety is depicted as the keystone or the cornerstone. And apparently, I'm told when you lay bricks, because obviously I don't ever lay bricks, I'm not that skilled at those types of things, but I'm told the first brick is the most important because that is what, with everything else, will rest. So if you don't lay the first brick right, your wall will not be formed correctly. So we need to make safety our cornerstone or our keystone. And that's not to say that patient satisfaction, quality, time, cost, physician satisfaction, employee satisfaction are not important. Those are very important. But if we don't get safety right, the rest of those won't fall in place. Now in healthcare, we are constantly faced with lots of choices. We have many, many competing priorities of focus. We are constantly under pressure for efficiency, patient satisfaction. Lots of different things compete for our focus. But we have to make sure that we're always putting safety as our core value. So, when we're faced with a situation like, I know I should do the timeout, but we're really backed up on cases, we should do the timeout. All right. If Mr. Jones is a fall risk, but I know he'll be angry if I stay in the bathroom with him, we should? Right. I just don't have time to do the patient identification. We should do the patient identification. Right. So we will be constantly faced with these competing priorities of focus, and we consistently need to make safety our top priority. Now I want to shift gears a little bit, and we're going to spend some time talking about a very important topic, especially in healthcare, something called power distance. And power distance is the perceived difference, not necessarily the real difference as seen by the subordinate. So it's the difference in power. If there is a small power difference, if there's a small distance, the relations are consultative, they're democratic, information flows well. When there's a large power distance, relations are paternalistic, and the flow of information is inhibited. It does not transfer well. Now, there are lots of things that contribute to power distance. One of them can be just education. So what's a common power distance? Nurse versus doctor, right? Or what department you work in or what specialty. In the medical field, Paul will state that he's right there with neurosurgery. This is my favorite group because I don't have any surgeons, so.
I'm sort of one.
Yeah, you're sort of one, right? So OB is a little bit higher in the hierarchy. At the top is, who's at the top?
Cardiothoracic surgeons.
Cardiothoracic ortho, cardiothoracic surgeon, neurosurgery, pediatricians. Yeah. Everybody laughs when I say that. Like, oh yeah. How about in nursing? How about times that you've been here? What do nurses say? Nurses eat. Right. Everybody knows it. Nurses eat their young. The older nurses are brutal to the younger nurses. Nurses eat their young. Sometimes we create a power distance unintentionally. We put things like reserved for doctors. Maybe it's just so they can come and go. But it creates a power distance unintentionally. And that's not to say power distance is always bad. You mentioned cardiothoracic surgeon. If James Narod comes in the room and it's an ER and he says, crack the chest, do it now. I'm glad there's a power distance. I'll just do what he says. But in general, the power distance will inhibit the flow of information. We have to turn back to the airline industry, our highly reliable organization, air travel, to completely understand power distance. And the reliability in airline travel did not come from improvement in technology alone. The greatest change the airline industry made was the adoption of something similar called crew resource management. And we go back to the 70s to understand where this originated. And the worst airline disaster in the history of aviation occurred on Tenerife Island. And some of you know this story because we read a book, When Hospitals Should Fly. But on this particular day, there was a terrorist threat at the main airport. And so all the 747s had to be diverted to Tenerife Island. And so they had a number of 747s land at this small airport that just had one runway. And then once the terrorist threat cleared, they had to get everybody out of there. And so there was lots of issues going on. Everybody was rushing to get out of there. The weather was coming on. There was time pressure. But the root cause of this accident was felt to be power distance. And what happened was there was a KLM 747 getting ready for takeoff. And as I said, there was only one runway. So to get ready for takeoff, you had to taxi down the same runway in the opposite direction and then turn around. So the KLM was getting ready for takeoff, and at the same time, a Pan Am 747 was taxiing down the runway. And they couldn't really see each other because of the weather, and the KLM was getting ready to take off as the Pan Am moved towards it. And the KLM, I guess when you're pilots, you're supposed to have 2 clearances for takeoff. And the pilot of the KLM was not a bad person. He wasn't difficult. In fact, he was the head pilot of the KLM Airline Corporation. His face was on the brochure of their pamphlet. So he was the lead pilot. And he happened to be with a co-pilot that day who was not as experienced. And he knew it was a privilege to fly with this gentleman. And so he got ready to take off, and the pilot got the okay for clearance for takeoff, but he didn't get the second clearance to go. And the recording in the cockpit clearly demonstrates the co-pilot trying to speak up. And when there's a power distance, it's not that we don't say anything. What happens is we change how we say it. We, what we call, mitigate it. We soften it. We're much more polite and we're much less direct. So we mitigate it when there's a power distance. So when I talk to Gary Brewer, I don't talk to Gary the same way I talk to Ellen. Well, maybe I do. I mitigate everything I say to Ellen and Gary. But when there's a power distance, we soften our language. We may not consciously know we're doing that, but it changes what can be interpreted by the person on the receiving end, and they may not hear it. So in this situation, the co-pilot does make mention that they shouldn't take off, but he mitigates it. And unfortunately, the pilot doesn't hear it. So it's not that he didn't speak up, it's that he mitigated it. And so he accelerates, the 2 747s crash, and over 500 people perish in And in fact, this issue with power distance comes up time and time again early in the 80s and 70s with airline travel. There was an Air Florida crash in 1981 into the Potomac River. Does anybody remember this? You remember when they crashed into the Potomac River in Washington, D.C.? I think the story is probably most famous. There was a passenger on the plane was in the water. The passenger was on the tail, and he time and time again hands the life preserver to somebody else, and he hands it off, and he hands it off, and he hands it off, and he dies. And there's actually video of his last moments handing it off. But in that airline crash, the same type of scenario happened. It was icy, it was cold, it was snowing. The co-pilot repeatedly makes comments about the severity of the ice. He says things like, "That's a lot of ice out there." And the pilot says, "Yeah, that's a lot of ice out there." He's attempting to say, maybe we should stop, maybe we should think about this. But he softens it over and over again. But he makes repeated comments, and they take off and crash into the Potomac River. In fact, one of the least reliable airlines used to be Korean Airlines. And Korean Airline had a second issue because culturally in Korea, you respect your elders, you respect your superiors. And so they never spoke up. And in fact, the Korean Airlines became so aware of this, their solution was to make their pilots speak in English. And the reason why that helped is because they didn't know English that well, so they couldn't come up with a lot of words or vocabulary to soften their language, so they would have to say things like "stop." And they couldn't soften it, and it's dramatically improved their reliability. When an airplane is being flown, the pilot and the co-pilot shift on and off, and they take turns. And in fact, do you think you're safer when the pilot is flying or when the less experienced co-pilot is flying? You're probably safer, you are safer when the less experienced co-pilot is flying because if something doesn't look right, the pilot will speak up, stop, and go on. However, when the pilot's flying, the co-pilot will be reluctant to speak up or will mitigate their speech. So this issue of power distance is very significant in healthcare. It's a constant issue. People speak up but have troubles communicating, or other people do not hear what they have to say. We will frequently hear a story where something went wrong, and one person will say, "I told him," and the other person will say, "They did not tell me." And then a lot of us will say, "Well, one of them is lying," but that's not right. They're probably both telling the truth. They did speak up, but they did not hear.